Hello, everybody. Welcome to 2019 and welcome to Robothorium. Robothorium is currently in early access right now and is being developed by Goblin's Studio, the people behind Dungeon Rushers, and also the people that are going to be soon putting out Legend of Keepers, which is something I want to take a look at as well. Robothorium will actually be pretty familiar to you if you've ever played a game like, say, what was it called? Halcyon 6. Halcyon 6 was a turn-based RPG, only instead of using characters, it was using ships in space. And it was a lot of fun. And Robothorium has a very similar feel to it. The combat is extremely similar, actually, only it's without the sort of overlying strategy layer that Halcyon 6 had. In this case, you play an intelligence, an artificial intelligence, who has control over an army of customizable robots that you send through various missions in order to, well, depending on if it's a side quest or the main quest, do something important. And the robots you have access to all have a different set of skills that you can switch between. Usually they have about 4 sort of active skills at any time, but there are actually more than that that you can actually choose from, and you can take one out of a slot and put a different one in if you want to create a sort of kit build that is meant to synergize with your other machines to create a party capable of beating tougher enemies. And it's actually pretty interesting how the leveling system works. As you can see in the background, there is a sort of skill circle. It's skill tree-ish, but it moves inwards on these circles, and the higher you level up and the more points you have to put into various things, eventually you can reach the sort of middle, really huge nodes in that circle. And basically what this is, the outer areas of the circle are meant to enhance all of the active abilities that each machine has in some way, oftentimes in things like percentage-based procs and other things of that nature. And every inner circle from there is some sort of passive ability that affects the way that they operate and the way that they synergize with the other machines, and it's actually a pretty cool way to make a sort of customizable kit for each robot. You also start by, you can choose which robots you actually start with, and as you go through the game you will get more of them. There are currently 6 of the classes in the game, and they plan on, by the end of the early access, actually having 10. Each class fulfills a pretty different role, actually, with wildly different abilities and capabilities as a result. And you also have a system of equipment, lots of different equipable parts, and generally speaking, each part can be equipped on one class of robot. However, there are a couple of different frames and such that can actually be shared between up to 3 different classes. And the items themselves come in different rarities, like you would think of in sort of an action RPG type of setting, and the extra rarities will have, well, the higher rarities will have extra bits attached to them in terms of what sort of stats they can improve on a machine that they're equipped to, and also the really, really high rarity stuff, the mythic stuff, is orange and tends to have extra passive abilities that you won't find anywhere else. Like, for instance, I have a weapon on the Berserker class, which is a sort of just pure damage dealing class, that has an extra percentage chance to basically add a large chunk of its damage to the basic attack of the robot, therefore like multiplying your attack like 2 times over effectively. And there are all sorts of them doing different things. And you'll want to have each robot equipped with different sort of synergistic kits, like I mentioned, in order to actually make it through the missions, because the missions can actually get quite difficult and quite long, as you would expect for this sort of game. You know, like I said, Halcyon 6 was also very similar, and if you weren't properly prepared for some of the later fights, they actually got kind of hairy. In this case, you have a sort of exploration layer instead of these strategy bits that game had, and as you explore through these levels, you will find various things that you can interact with. Anything from, say, an NPC, like a cyborg, or just like a security panel on the wall, or a big turret in the middle of the room, or an EMP mine. There are all sorts of different traps and activatable items that you will come across, and you'll have different choices of how to deal with each one, and depending on your party and your alertness level, basically the alarm level of the place that you're in, each action has a different percentage chance of actually succeeding. And this actually shapes part of the story as well. Currently in the early access, I don't think they actually have the multiple endings in yet, but they plan on actually creating multiple endings for the game, because there's actually a faction system, and sometimes different actions have an impact on the different factions that are in the game. They will, you know, give you a better standing with one, or sometimes they'll give you like a really good standing with one while also reducing the standing of another one and things like that. And each different faction obviously has different beliefs and therefore different ways to actually affect how they see you, positively or negatively. And they also have 3 different thresholds on the positive side that actually give you bonuses if you're able to get there standing up to that level. For instance, one of the simplest ones is the idea that given enough reputation with the very first faction that you will generally come across, you can actually increase the chance of any action in any of the maps by a flat 5%, which sounds kind of small, but is actually really, really useful because a lot of these actions are necessary for actually successfully moving through the levels safely. And the more of them you fail, the more you build up the alert level, which will make the chances of further actions decrease. So it tends to snowball at that point. And also, the higher the alert level goes, the more powerful the enemies that you find will get. So you definitely want to keep that low, unless you're looking to like power level something. And some of the other factions actually have a little bit more complicated things. Like for instance, there's a merchant faction that you'll meet usually the last of the main ones. And it's a lot harder to actually influence its reputation with, but at the very highest reputation level that you can get, the black market, the in-game shop that you can access whenever you're at the base, at the sort of between mission areas, you can actually sometimes purchase mythic items for a very high price. So very powerful, very rare items can actually be found at the shop. So they're definitely worth actually using. The reputation system is worth exploring and understanding because it provides you a lot of very useful bonuses and extra effects for actually exploring the game. The levels themselves are, right now there aren't a tremendous number of tile sets for the levels, there are only a few, but they look pretty good, and they're quite large. They're pretty sprawling, sort of multi-path levels with different sort of locked doors that you have to go to other areas of the zone to find the way through and all sorts of things like that. And they have lots of different hazards and activatable objects, so you'll tend to spend quite a bit of time in any given area of the game, and of course there are the fights. Eventually, you are bound to run into at least one fight on a given mission that you have to complete. And one thing I've noticed about the fights is that they seem to kind of match the number of enemies with the number of robots on your side. So if you only bring 2 robots into a mission, you'll probably only be fighting 2 or 3 enemies per battle. But if you bring your maximum, which is 5, then you'll be finding 5 or 6 enemies every time you fight. And the level of the missions, of course, influences the level of the enemies that you're going to be finding in the missions, obviously. And the battles can actually take a little while, very similar to, like I said, Halcyon 6. The battles can draw out a bit, although not to a negative point, I feel. They last, I think, as long as they need to, because there is a lot of strategy involved in actually using your abilities well, using them successfully to the point where they actually benefit each other and you don't get destroyed. One interesting thing about the battle system in general is that everything is persistent, so that if you have a very high level of damage after a battle and you go to the next battle, that robot will still be damaged. So there's no healing per se per battle. You have to have an actual healing robot in your party to help. And also there is a heat system, an overload system, where everything but your basic attack, every robot has a sort of basic attack and then a bunch of special abilities. That basic attack reduces your overload. It's basically like heat, and everything besides that increases it. And that is also persistent. So if you, say, end a battle with very high heat on a lot of your party, and then you get into another battle, you'll start with high heat as well, so you won't be able to open that new battle with a bunch of fancy abilities or anything, because you'll have to reduce your heat first. So that's another part of the strategy to make sure that you're actually using your abilities correctly. It's not about using the strongest one all the time, because there isn't really a strongest one, and if you use too many heat-generating abilities, you'll eventually overload your robot, which makes it have to skip a turn. But you can do the same thing to the other guys. Occasionally, the enemies will actually just overload themselves, which is a legitimate strategy, because sometimes you're willing to trade that extra turn for one turn of like very high damage or a big heal or something like that. You just need it right now, so overloading is sort of an acceptable loss at the time. And the enemies will do that occasionally as well, but there are different robot classes that are a lot more about, instead of direct damage, they're more about sort of manipulating the heat levels of the enemy. The Song class robot, which is that very top orange one with the drums that you see, is all about the enemy's overload levels. You can do things like just increasing the overload of the entire enemy field by like a flat 20% to actually triggering a song that does damage to an entire line of enemies, a vertical line, depending on how much overload they currently have. But a lot of his attacks also build up overload on himself very, very quickly, and so a lot of his skill tree items are based on reducing his overload or increasing the maximum amount that he can hold before he loses a turn, and things like that. So you can see how it kind of matches together. And probably my favorite so far is that top left one on the back side that has a little drone next to it. That's a scout class robot, and it has a lot of abilities based on the sort of marking mechanic that a lot of turn-based RPGs have something like this, where you can mark a target, and then any of the abilities further used on that target have some sort of special effect in addition to the normal ones because it's a marked target. And in that case, he can do everything from marking a target so that every time his turn comes up, he gets a couple of free shots at them, which is very useful, as you could expect, to things like making sure that when you fire his basic attack, it actually bounces between every target that's currently marked for free. So it's basically like free damage in an AoE kind of way, when normally he's very focused on just single target damage. And you can also do things like spreading every single negative debuff on an enemy to another enemy, which is obviously very useful for things like marking an enemy and then spreading the mark around the party so that your shots bounce everywhere, and making him like really, really useful for taking out larger numbers of enemies. And you can even have a positive effect in the skill tree for him that causes every time you use that, this thing is called splash ammo, that transfers the debuffs from one enemy to another to actually transfer it to 2 other enemies. So now you have like 3 marked enemies if you use it right, and can cause like a storm of effects. Is really, really useful, and that basically kind of encompasses the entirety of how the combat works. You have every class of robot having very, very specific uses for their abilities, and you have to just get them to work well with each other. There's also a final class of skill for every robot that's called the Thoriumeter abilities, which are the sort of ulti. Basically, it's an ultimate attack that they can use, and these are on a cooldown. Every other ability in the game, interestingly enough, does not use a cooldown system. It just uses the heat generation system instead to limit their usages. But these particular ultimate attacks actually do use a cooldown, and it starts at 0, so you can't actually use them at the beginning of a mission. You have to continue to accrue turns in order to actually use them, and they're very strong. Everything from a bouncing, very powerful shot that hits everyone to reducing everyone's overload down to 0 and all sorts of things like that. So they're really, really useful to use on bigger fights and against bosses and things, and there are bosses that are pretty fun. And you unlock the ability to use those if you play the story through enough to actually sort of have the story event occur that unlocks them. The game right now is in a pretty good state. It is, of course, not finished. It's, we'll say, like 65% finished according to their Steam page and how much stuff they actually have in it compared to how much stuff they plan to have in it. But it is currently at the price of $15, which is actually not bad considering the amount that's in it, and they may or may not actually increase that as the time goes on and it gets closer to being finished. It's in the description below this video. You'll find the link, of course, to the early access page, and as far as early access games go, I haven't really encountered any bugginess in this one, so I don't think, I mean, I'm sure there are some. That goes without saying with pretty much any game ever, but I haven't encountered any sort of large, glaring or game-breaking bugs or anything at this point, so most of the early access time is, I think, going to be spent on rounding out the actual content and figuring out the other endings and things like that. So that is the current state of Robothorium, a pretty interesting and enjoyable turn-based RPG with a sci-fi aesthetic and robots to control. Also, the game has a sort of rogue-like-ish influenced mode where if you lose a robot in a mission, it is gone for good, if you want to play it that way, which is pretty cool, but I think I'll wait until the game fully comes out to actually use that particular difficulty. So that is Robothorium. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you want to see more, have any questions, the comment box is below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.